I'd like to press your clothes, mend your hose. Tell me, cutie, who tied your tie?
Hello, welcome to 20th Century Adventures. I'm Nathan Logsdon, and today we're going to talk about neckties. Now, this has been a project that I've wanted to do for about a year. I actually had hoped to put it out on the anniversary of the 1923 patent for the necktie. But once I got into it, I realized, boy, there's so much more. I was barely scratching the surface with that. So it took a lot of research, and this is actually the second time I filmed this video because after I filmed it the first time, I realized I had to get some more information in there. So bear with me. There's a lot coming at you here, but the history of the necktie is really quite involved. So there's a lot of questions as to where it began. We don't really know for sure. There's a lot of speculation and archaeological evidence that shows that it may go back to very early times, that possibly the Egyptians wore something similar to a necktie. But what we can really trace with a reasonable amount of accuracy is that it probably started sometime in the mid-17th century during the 30 Years' War, and carried on with minimal changes up to about 1820 or so, in the form of a silk cravat like this. And so there's a couple different ways that this could be done, and it could be made in black or white or red. Those were all popular colors. Sometimes it was pleated, sometimes it was left like this. Sometimes it had fancy lacework and knotwork in it. Clocking, we call it. So let's fast forward to the end of this period, the early 19th century. This would have been worn with a collar that went straight up against the neck, and then it would be crisscrossed, starting in the front, come around, and depending on situation, could be tied in a variety of styles around the neck like that. And it was meant to hold the shirt collar up against the cheeks. So we also know that going back probably as early as the late 18th century, workmen would wear a simple neckerchief, and this would be worn around the neck over a work shirt. And this was meant to keep the shirt closed and tight against the neck, help keep the neck warm, but also could be used to absorb sweat and could be taken off and used for various purposes, like a hot rag to take something off the fire, or for washing up or anything. It was a general purpose, more like a handkerchief is used today, I guess. But this is just a triangle of fabric. And really that continued on up into the late 19th century. This is not that different from your classic cowboy face covering. So when they're driving cattle on the range, going out to graze or taking them to market, those 10,000 head of cattle and some horses stirs up a lot of dust, and so they would wear this over the nose, to cover, to keep from breathing so much dust. And of course, the classic stagecoach robber or train robber used these to hide their identity as well. And by the late 19th century, that had really evolved into something more like this, where it was a fancy, colorful piece. And this is square, more so than the rectangular. And this could be folded into halves diagonally and still used like the triangular one. But it had more uses in that, first off, it's doubled thickness when you're using it. So that helps a lot. Absorbs more dust and keeps you a little warmer. But this could also be rolled up. This is especially good on a hot day. Roll this up and get it wet, and then wear it around your neck like so. And that'll help keep your neck cool as that evaporates. So lots of practical purposes. However, in the especially in the well, in the 19th century in general, they also became a fashion statement, and was used in conjunction with more formal attire as a dress item, and generally became used every day. Really, from the 18th century on, you wore a tie of some sort, a neckerchief or something, cravat, every single day. You didn't go out in public without it. From about the mid 18th century up to probably the mid 20th century. Um, so we're going to look at some of those now. Um, so this is the closest ancestor to the modern necktie. Now, bow ties go back further. They go back to probably 1840s, and there's a variety of designs in that. Of course, Abraham Lincoln wore a bow tie in all of his portraits. So bow ties were quite popular in the 19th century, and they continued to be popular, and they're still popular today. It's still one of the most common neckties worn, although it's gone through a lot of evolutions as well. But we're going to talk about the regular necktie. This is a Victorian necktie. This one's probably from the 1890s, maybe 1900, somewhere in there. So what this is this is a double layer of silk. It's sewn together. The two pieces are sewn together all the way around the edge. So it's two strips of fabric, this wide, with seam allowance, of course, and it stays this wide all the way. So how it gets skinnier in the middle is through pleats. This has got 3 pleats sewn into it, and that's what made it skinny in the middle. And then, of course, this would be tied in many of the popular styles that we still use today as far as knots. The Windsor knot, the 4-in-hand, so on and so forth. And I'm not going to get into knots. There's so many of them. It would take forever to do this video if we got into that. But you can Google tie knots and even the history of tie knots, and you can see what's appropriate for whatever period you're trying to do. Now, this tie, you could probably wear this up to about 1910, one this style. However, by that time, they were starting to change the look a little bit. They were wide at one end and skinnier in the middle, and they had a series of folds, and there were different ways that it was done. And there's so many examples in that period that it's hard to get into it all, but suffice to say, from 1905 to about 1920, you're going to see a lot of variation in ties, and some of them are going to be a single layer of silk or wool or cotton. Cotton and linen are less common. It seems like they're mostly wool and silk, and sometimes they'll be just simply hemmed along the edge with a real fine hem, and sometimes they'll be doubled like this one is. The problem with those ties, and these ties as well, is there's no stiffness to them. It doesn't retain its shape real well. Now the 6-fold tie, which I'll get into here in a little bit, held it a little bit better because of the way it was constructed and folded over in layers. But really, it was still had problems with distorting and not staying stiff enough. And you can see how the wind is catching this, and it's just blowing it everywhere. Now, the one solution for that is to add a tie tack. So you might have something like this. This is a piece of jewelry that's just a pin with a little stopper on the bottom, and then some fancy piece of jewel work at the top. And these could go from being very simple and very cheap to costing thousands of dollars, even in the 19th century, that they were very expensive. So you would tie your tie, and then that would go in right below the knot and pin through the tie and your shirt, and that would hold it in place better. That and your vest, of course. Normally you would be wearing a vest, and so that helps hold it together. But for somebody who wasn't dressing to the nines but still needed to wear a tie for business purposes or whatever, and remember that workmen wore ties in this period. We're talking the first 10 years of the 20th century, especially. A lot of workmen still wore ties, and craftsmen as well. So you don't necessarily want to wear a expensive stick pin that you could lose, and you may not even be wearing a vest if you're doing any sort of manual labor, but you would still keep your shirt closed with a tie. So this began to lose fashion because of its flowiness. And you can see a lot of photographs, even studio photographs from this period up to 1915, where the tie is clearly silk and it's clearly one layer, and it's becoming unfolded in the photograph. And the guy's obviously sitting in a studio where there's no wind. So just the irony of that, that it's splaying out and going crazy. So enter on the scene a fellow named, well, let's back up a little bit here. First, we'll talk about the six-fold tie. Now, the six-fold tie goes back earlier in my research than the pattern that I used to make this reproduction. So with a six-fold tie, the tie is cut real wide, and you can adjust the width depending on how far you fold the tie. So like this one's a skinnier tie, and the fold comes all the way to the other edge. If I wanted a wider tie, which wide ties were very popular, you see all types. You see pretty much every width of tie in this period. Remember, they're going through all kinds of changes, and everybody's trying to make a tie that is different from everybody else's. So you can make it wider by simply moving that seam towards the middle. But this has got fabric folded over, and there's a total of 6 folds. That's where it gets its name. And then it is tacked down or sewn down to keep it together. And so it retains this shape, and it can't shift, it can't come unfolded because it's sewn together down the sides. So there's a great pattern for this. It's by a company called Eva Dress, and they place it as a 1937 tie. But based on my research, I think it goes much earlier, possibly back as far as 1920 for sure. So the 6-fold tie is pretty easy to make, and we also carry them on our website, logsandco.com, so you can find them there as well. And that would easily be acceptable for anything post-World War I. So now we're going to jump ahead to Jesse Langsdorf. So Jesse Langsdorf became frustrated with all the tie options and felt that none of them were sufficiently stable and presenting a good look. So what he did was he created his own version of a tie, and this is Langsdorf's tie. This actually has a tag inside of it. If I can find it, I'll show it here in a minute. So this tie, there it is, specifically has a stamp on it and a patent number. And it says February 27th, 1923, and has the patent number on it. So this is a tie that was made in the 20s because it has that patent date on it. Langsdorf wasn't able to hold that pattern or that patent very well. At first, he tried to pursue people that were using his patent fraudulently, but he really couldn't afford to keep up with it. It was such a good design that everybody started copying it, and eventually he just gave up on it. So this is definitely a pre-1930 tie. This one's silk, and the way that it's designed based on the patent, It's a narrower piece of fabric, so there's not as much width to it altogether. The folds are sewn into place down the middle. It doesn't have as many folds as the six-fold tie does. Furthermore, it has a piece of bias cut canvas, and some examples I've seen buckram used as well, a light, soft sort of buckram. But generally, it has a cotton canvas or a heavy, tight weave wool that's cut on the bias. And what that does is it stiffens the interior of that tie. So this tie feels a lot thicker than these other ties do, just because it's got that extra layer, and that runs all the way through to the other side. So this tie is sewn together like the six-fold. It's sewn down the middle to hold it all in place, and then that interfacing holds it helps it holds its shape. So for 1923 and later, you can wear this style of tie, which is actually pretty much the modern tie. This has not changed except in length since 1923 when Jesse Langsdorf came up with this idea. Merchants loved it because it used less fabric and it held together better. It didn't stretch out of shape or distort, and it was cheaper to produce. So that's why everybody jumped on the bandwagon, and that's the way that ties are still made to this day. So, as not to say that the six-fold tie went away entirely, this is a U.S. Army tie for an Army uniform from World War II. So this is the, I think the 1937 or 39 uniform tie. And it's got military stamping on the back of it. But this is a six-fold tie. It's exactly the same as this. And it's tacked down with stitches to hold it in place, keep it from moving and distorting. Obviously, the Army was trying to make these as cheap as possible, and so they probably didn't want to pay Langsdorf for his patent, so they used an older style. The government doesn't get away with fudging on patents the way that the rest of commercial America was able to. So this is another tie from the 1940s. This one is done on the Langsdorf pattern, and it's lined inside. So it's a silk layer on the outside and a different silk layer on the inside. But here's that interfacing in the middle. This one's wool. The interfacing there, sort of almost a soft buckram, that holds that tie together and holds its shape. So that's the basics. Now, what we also need to be aware of is the length of the tie. So we'll go back to this Victorian tie for a minute here. And notice that this is fairly short. When I tie this around my neck, we'll just do a basic knot here. All right. And with the Victorian look, you might want to not go through the, you can go through this band here the way you tie a modern tie. That was done. There's plenty of photographs to do that. But you can also leave it over the top and then put your stick pin in there, and that gives you a real nice Victorian look. So if you're trying to do something early, do that. But notice that this stops above my belly button. My belly button's right here, and that's where my trousers come up to. So that's pretty high. And a lot of ties remained that high, even up to 1915. We continue to see ties that stand up high. Although we also, in that same period from say 1905 to 1915, we also see ties that are a little longer. You see ties that are this wide, you see ties that are this wide. So it really varies a lot, and you can kind of play around and do what you like, more or less, as long as you aren't getting too far on the length. So this one, again, like I said, I think this was made off of the Eva Dress 1937 three-fold tie or six-fold tie, and it's I really think it's earlier. So let's say 1920, because notice how high this comes. So this comes up really high, and we know that later ties were not coming up quite so high, or we're staying lower rather. So we pull this up here, and that's a little lower than the Victorian tie. So my belly button's here, so it's maybe a good inch lower, but this is a very appropriate length for teens and 20s. And again, you can go a little higher. You can't go much lower. You don't want to go past the belly button at all in this period. Before 1950, you will not go past the belly button at all, tie. So keep it in this range. It can be anywhere from the sternum to the belly button, but it has to fall into that range. We don't see any higher than that, and we don't see any lower than that. Now we look at, if we compare, say, this reproduction Eva dress tie to the original 1920s Langsdorf pattern, that is exactly the same length. So again, that supports this tie going earlier. Now to throw a loop in things, we've got the World War II tie, which is also about the same length. But again, they were trying to use the older pattern so they didn't have to pay for patents on clothing. Now we'll compare it to this one. This one's probably mid to late 40s. And here we see that it is significantly longer. This tie would probably, say, it'll probably reach my belly button. Yeah. So this one, I tied that a little off. It should be probably about there. And it does. It comes to my belly button. But again, this is probably post World War II, pre 1950. Now, another type of tie that was popular, and this is pretty much a win anywhere from the late Victorian period, 1890s, on up to the 1970s. This remained popular. This is a knit sock tie. It's knit in a tube. It's even got the same sort of finishing that the top of a sock has. These were usually skinny. They were only maybe 2 inches wide. But this is a reproduction one, and it's made out of some sort of polyester satin. They would be wool. They would always be wool. And then it'd be a little shorter than this. So for our period, we want this to come up to about here. Okay. So we're going to want a shorter knit tie. There's a company called World War I Knits, and I think they do these in wool and in the proper length. So that would be a good place to find one of those, perhaps. Now, of course, the bow tie, which I'm wearing here, this is a modern bow tie, modern silk bow tie, and the shape certainly matches a lot of other ties, bow ties from the 1920s. So you can buy a modern silk bow tie, and it'll be just fine. Furthermore, pre-tied bow ties on a band that clips with a hook and eye is perfectly fine. That goes back. Originally, they had buckles on the back, and so you have a pre-tied bow tie with a buckle in the back, and that goes back as far as the Civil War. But as far as for our period, with the hook and eye closure, those pre-tied bow ties are totally appropriate, really from about 1900 on. Um, they didn't like tying these things either. So, but of course, a hand-tied one is always correct too. This is an original tie from the 19 teens. Actually, no, I'm sorry, it's earlier than that. This has got a patent called the Perfect Tie. And it's patented. The first patent is June 21st, 1898. The second patent is May 9th, 1905. So this falls right into that early period of 1900s. And it's kind of a skinnier bow tie. And it is a folded bow tie, or a tied, self-tie. What's also interesting about it is it's got a buttonhole in the back, and it's got these little tabs with buttonholes. So what's that for? Well, we're going to talk briefly about detachable collars, because that falls into play with all this as well. So this is a detachable collar. Sorry, it's got some stains on it. I've worn it to work in. This is a shirt that would go with that. And these were popular from the 1890s on up to the 1920s. They were beginning to lose popularity by the mid-20s for sure. But this has a wide range. So you've got a buttonhole in the back of the shirt. There's a buttonhole in the back of the collar. And we've got a buttonhole in the back of the tie. So what we're going to do is we're going to use one of these. This is our collar studs. You're going to start by putting it in the neck of the shirt. Take the taller one. You'll have two of them. Let me show this maybe in a little more detail. So you'll have these two studs. One will be taller than the other. And you want to take the taller one. No, I'm sorry. You'll take the shorter one. Shorter one goes in the back. So it goes first into the collar of the shirt. Then it goes into the collar that attaches to the shirt. And then lastly, it's going to go through the back of the bow tie, or the middle of the bow tie. I probably should have had a taller stud, but it's going on there. We got it. All right. And they made little hooks for these too. So when you get to buttoning the end of it around the neck, it really can be quite complicated. So having the little button hook is good. You can buy collars and collar studs and the buttoning tool from Darcy Clothing. They're out of England, and they make some really good stuff. You can find these shirts there too. So that's a great resource. So now what we're going to do is we're going to lay this across here. And I think this collar is a little short, or the bow tie is a little short for my neck. So this isn't going to work out real well. So we put the longer stud through the shirt, through one side of the collar, and then that little tab is going to button on right there. That actually is not too bad. Now, this is the point where you need to put the shirt on, because you're never going to get all this together and on yourself if you don't put the shirt on now. So you put the shirt on, now you've got everything in place, and you want to lay this tie down inside there and go ahead and flip that collar down, because you'll never get the tie up under the collar if you don't put it in there first. So now, assume we have the shirt on, we're going to bring this around, and you'll take the tie back off of the stud, take the collar back off the stud. Now you're going to button the other side of the shirt, and then this side of the collar, and then the other side of the collar, and then you'll button, see if I can do this. This is where the hook comes in necessary. So then you'll button the bow tie on, and this is a little small. I would never get this around my neck, this original bow tie. I'm not even going to get it buttoned here. And then you'd button this side onto that stud as well, and then you'd tie your bow tie. Very, very involved and complicated, but it gives a really good, crisp look. It's a really nice look. And you could get away with not laundering your shirts as often if you had several collars to wear. You wouldn't need to be changing shirts as often. So a lot of times you'd have 3 collars for every shirt you owned. So now we'll look at this. This is an original paper package of collars. It says Aratex collars, 35 cents each, 3 for $1. To launder, to obtain best results, dip in a very thin cooked starch. These were usually starched like crazy. Now, Darcy does offer one that is washable, and so it stays stiff no matter what. They're a little harder to clean, but which is why this one's stained like it is. But the starched collars you can do as well. So here's a bunch of original collars that we'll look at. And again, it's a very tight woven fabric. I've never seen fabric as tightly woven as these collars are. It's hard to find fabric like that nowadays. And then some of them were prettier. This one's got some ribbing on it. This off. This one I think is silk, and it's ribbed, so it gives it a really pretty look. Here's another ribbed one. I don't know if these are the collars that came in this package. They're probably not, because they've got a different brand on them. But they're really neat, and it's neat to have the paper package with them as well. So that, in a nutshell, is the history of neckties in our period as it pertains to our period. Start wearing a tie. It's great for a lot of purposes. I've found that I love deer hunting with a wool tie. I will not deer hunt without a wool necktie on, just because it holds that collar together, it holds heat in, it keeps scent from coming out of the neck of my shirt. Sometimes, especially if you're really in the woods a lot, you've been hunting a lot, you can tell when you walk and you perspire just a little bit, you can smell that body smell. Even though it's not necessarily that you smell bad, you might be clean, but you're trying not to put on modern deodorants and things because you don't want deer to smell you. Well, they're going to smell you anyway. And so if the more that you can cover your skin and keep it tight to contain it, the less that odor is going to leak out. And a necktie does a great job of keeping that shirt closed so that doesn't happen. Also keeps warmth in. I really recommend it, especially for deer hunting, wearing a wool necktie. Just makes all the difference in the world. First time I did it, I thought, man, I should have been doing this all along. Generally, you can wear a necktie for anything that doesn't run the risk of getting it caught. What killed the necktie for everyday wear by everybody was the machine age. So when you're motoring, especially if you're a mechanic, you don't want to lean over a running engine with a necktie. It's going to get caught and you're going to have a bad day. Same way with factory work and things like that. So the tie went away from being something that every man wore to being something that was only worn by certain classes of people. Therefore, the upper class, the lower working poor blue collar class, didn't wear them anymore because it was dangerous. You could get it caught in a piece of machinery as people drifted towards factory work. But farmers still wore them for a long time. I actually spoke to a 90-year-old woman who remembered opening day of squirrel season every year. This would have been, I think she was referring to the 1950s and 60s. And the old men would come out with their ties on to go squirrel hunting. So it was done. And we see a lot of photographs of people in ordinary settings doing ordinary things and wearing their necktie because it was just proper. And especially for the older generation. If you're of a certain age, let's say you're in your 60s to 80s, and you're trying to do a 1920 impression, you would have grown up in an era where it was inappropriate to be seen without a necktie of some sort. So, and you would also be of an age where you probably wouldn't be working on a machine line anymore. So in that situation, especially if you're out camping or something, it'd be very appropriate for you older gentlemen to wear a tie. So I hope this gives you some good information. I hope you've learned something, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please click like and subscribe. And be sure to check us out on logsandco.com, and we'll see you down the road.